Indigenous women, the ones who play a central role in Indigenous communities, culture, and family. The women participated in ceremonies and governance of their people. Indigenous women were well respected in society and had equal opportunities with their male counterparts. But that has all changed. Indigenous women have now suffered from the consequences of colonization by European settlers. And to this day, Indigenous women are now suffering from going missing and even murdered in their own homes. Today, Indigenous women are suffering from the current issues of the lack of awareness of historical wrongdoings, the lack of news coverage and media attention, and the responses on a social and governmental level.
The ongoing crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls is a crisis centuries in the making and continues into the present. Similar to other races or marginalized groups, Indigenous women face a double burden: one, being a woman, and two, being Indigenous. Before European colonization in Canada, women played active roles in their communities without facing restrictions. They held valued and respected positions within society. However, with the arrival of Europeans, a patriarchal perspective was imposed on Indigenous peoples and their cultural practices. Through colonial policies such as those enacted by the Crown, led to significant alterations in women's influence and social systems in a relatively short period of time. The Canadian government took away many rights of Indigenous families, especially Indigenous women, under the Federal Indian Act, along with many other legally sanctioned policies. Some of these also include the residential schools, the 60s Scoop, and the current quote-unquote millennial scoop. Colonialism relies on the widespread dehumanization of all Indigenous people. Yet this dehumanization is felt most acutely in the bodies of Indigenous girls, women, two-spirit, and transgender people, as they continue to endure physical and sexual violence, which is accepted as normal.
Despite representing only a small fraction of the population, data shows that Indigenous women consistently exceeded the homicide rates when compared to non-Indigenous women. Statistics collected from 2009 to 2021 revealed that Indigenous women face homicide rates 6 times higher than non-Indigenous women. Additionally, Indigenous women represented 5 to 7% of the homicide rates in Canada, while only accounting for 2 to 3% of the total population. Oftentimes, the cycle of violence begins in childhood, with a devastating 42% reporting physical and sexual abuse before the age of 15. This early trauma sets the stage for continued victimization, with Indigenous women experiencing disproportionately high rates of violence as adults, including sexual assault and intimate partner violence. Additionally, the data shows that most Indigenous women who fell victim to homicide knew their attackers. Overwhelmingly, 81% were killed by someone they knew intimately, such as a partner or family member, with 86% of the accused individuals being Indigenous themselves. The statistics presented here paints a bleak picture of the harsh realities faced by Indigenous women across Canada. The impacts of the missing and murdered Indigenous women extend far beyond these numbers, as it represents a profound loss of families and communities. These women are more than just statistics. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives who held significance in this world. Their presence mattered, and tragically, they were taken from us far too soon. That said, it is essential that we continue to raise awareness, advocate for justice, and work towards reconciliation to ensure the safety and well-being of Indigenous women across Canada.
The disproportionate number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada is staggering. Over the past 3 decades, there have been reports of 164 missing Indigenous women and 1,017 reports of those who got murdered. So, why is there a lack of media attention and news coverage on this issue? Despite the distressing numbers, it turns out that the media framing of this current issue for non-Indigenous in terms of its coverage, tone, and content are different. Missing and murdered Indigenous women received less news coverage compared to non-Indigenous women in several details in media stories. Furthermore, the media frames non-Indigenous women as valued community members, whereas Indigenous women are sex workers, criminals, and other titles. The media's misrepresentation and limited attention to murdered Indigenous women and girls suggests that this current issue is not worth it to be in news coverage.
Despite the lack of help from the justice system in thoroughly investigating this crisis, Indigenous community actors took a firm stance towards the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Walsh acknowledges activists have argued that countering violence requires the dismantling of heteropatriarchal colonial structures, and thus have established spaces for community-led investigations. Subsequently, a Sisters in Spirit activism group developed by the National Women's Association of Canada were the grassroots in developing an inquiry for this crisis. The arousal of the Sisters in Spirit community encouraged other activism groups to start a campaign in investigating missing and murdered Indigenous women. Walsh emphasized the poignant and visible nature of the campaign propelled the issue into public consciousness, capturing the attention of the national media. The attention of the campaign forced the government to take a stance in resolving this crisis. Walsh acknowledges, in September 2016, an inquiry body composed of 5 Indigenous commissioners was given a budget of $53.8 million, with the expectation that their work will be completed by the end of 2018. The development of this plan was created for remedial actions in resolving the factors influencing missing and murdered Indigenous women, with the ideology in honoring past victims. Press proved the validity of this commitment in addressing the national inquiry. Press highlights the attention of Michael Audit, a commissioner for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Group inquiry, who was firm on the thought that commitment by provinces, territories, including all levels of government, have been delayed. She further emphasized that action towards the plan should be made to responding to the crisis of violence against Indigenous women.
As shown, the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada has been a profound crisis that has demanded both social and governmental responses. The Canadian government has acknowledged the severity of the issue, recognizing the urgent need for action. In its National Action Plan to address missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the government outlines its commitment to addressing the root causes and systemic factors that contribute to violence against Indigenous women and girls. The plan emphasizes the importance of collaboration between all levels of government, Indigenous communities, and various stakeholders to effectively address this crisis. One of the key elements of the government's response is the commitment to implementing a trauma-informed approach to support Indigenous communities. This approach recognizes the intergenerational trauma inflicted upon Indigenous peoples due to colonial policies and practices. By prioritizing trauma-informed initiatives, the government aims to provide culturally appropriate support services that acknowledge the unique experiences and needs of Indigenous women and girls. Additionally, the government emphasizes the importance of prevention and early intervention strategies to address violence against Indigenous women and girls. This includes initiatives aimed at improving access to education, employment opportunities, and housing, as well as supporting community-led initiatives that promote healing and empowerment. By investing in these preventative measures, the government seeks to address the underlying factors that contribute to the vulnerability of Indigenous women, girls, and children to violence. While the government's National Action Plan represents a step in the right direction, there are ongoing concerns about its implementation and effectiveness. Critics argue that meaningful progress requires more than just policy commitments. It requires concrete actions and resource allocation to support Indigenous communities in their efforts to address violence and promote safety. There are calls for increased accountability mechanisms to ensure that the government remains committed to its obligations and follows through on its promises. Meanwhile, on a social level, there has been a growing awareness and grassroots mobilization around the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Indigenous activists, advocates, and allies have been instrumental in raising awareness, amplifying the voices of affected families, and demanding justice for the victims. Community-led initiatives such as the Moosehide Campaign and Butterflies and Spirits play a crucial role in providing support, raising awareness, and advocating for systemic change. Overall, addressing the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls requires a comprehensive and collaborative approach that involves meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities, effective policy implementation, and a commitment to justice and accountability at all levels of society. While progress has been made, much more work remains to be done to ensure the safety, dignity, and rights of Indigenous women and girls are upheld.